Hi, folks. Let's begin. I've got the second worst slot in the world. Because there's a keynote, it's a bad slot, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, it's a bad slot. But the worst slot in the world is the one after the big party in the morning at 9 o'clock. So I haven't got that one, so that's kind of fine. I'll try and keep it not too horribly difficult to understand. I'm told I have an accent. I don't, but if you think I do and I speak too fast, please raise your hand, and I'll probably ignore you, but at least you've made the effort, right? So I'm kind of hoping we got a bit of a clue about the first bit, but this is kind of what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to say up front, apologies for this picture. I hadn't realized when I was using this picture that the picture we're using is the infinity one, as in there's no escape, right? That's the one that we're using for DevOps. But I'll explain why I've used this picture in a bit. It's a simplified way of looking at the whole DevOps circle. So this is a one description, definition of DevOps that I've come across a couple of times. I quite like it. Take it or leave it, but it's a starting point. But I wanted to start that because I wanted to come up with to bring up this, which is a DevSecOps definition. I love this definition, but I know that's because I'm a security guy. And if you're not a security person, this probably fills you with absolute horror. Saying security is everybody's responsibility is great if you're a security person, right? But if you're not, suddenly being told that security is your responsibility is not great, right? And it's not just, one person in the chain. If we're going to go with 5 things, there's at least 5 sets of people who now have security as their responsibility. How are you supposed to deal with that? So that's what I'm going to try and talk about a little bit in the next 30 or so minutes. I'm going to try and leave some space for questions as well. So I was in a meeting a while ago, and colleagues came out with this. A colleague's been around for even longer than I have. He said, for 20 years, people have been leaving security till last. And I just sort of put those 2 extra, say we could lose those 2, because people just don't remember to put security in. But I speak to a lot of customers, and wrong one. And obviously, nobody does waterfall anymore, right? Everyone nod along. Everybody does waterfall still, at least a bit. But the problem is that this is what it looks like. Yeah, this is what a classic, very simplified version of a classic waterfall project should look like. Design, develop, test, stage. It's lovely, right? And suddenly somebody realizes that actually security probably should be in there a bit as well. What do we do? This is what the project manager hopes can happen, right? We'll put it in just before we deploy. It'll only take a fraction of the time of all the other bits and pieces. And then the security architect is asked to come up with a guess, and his or her guesstimate is it's going to be, seriously, at least as long as any of the others. And this is what actually happens. I saw a really good presentation a couple of years ago at RSA. I've never been able to track down the presentation, sadly, which the presenter not only sort of looked at actual waterfall projects and said, well, this is actually what happens, and proved it with numbers, which is no surprise to anybody, frankly, but also looked at money numbers and said, assuming this is what's going to happen, and he had proof that it does from actual empirical evidence, so it must be true, he said, if this happens, it is cheaper to have someone on your team doing security from the beginning and doing nothing for 90% of their time than it is to slip the date by the amount he was seeing. Now, as a security person, doing nothing for 90% of my time sounds great. particularly if I'm getting paid for the full 100%. But I think the point is that we know that you can't leave it to last. And you certainly can't leave it to last in a waterfall. But how does it fit then into a DevOps kind of world? So this is why I used the round one, the circle, rather than the infinity symbol, because I can put it in the middle. It's as simple as that, and I do apologize, but it just works a bit better. Just going to grab my water from here, sorry. So as you'll see, I've put policy, process, and procedures in there, because I think we need to think of all of them, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. So I'm going to give you an example of a couple of types of areas where security can, and I would say has to be baked in if we're actually going to make DevOps DevSecOps. So who's a J.R. Tolkien fan? Oh, come on. Really, is that all? Okay, you guys you should leave after this, go out and buy yourself on Kindle or actual, get yourself the Hobbit and read through the Hobbit. It's more important than all of the other things at this conference, probably. Okay, so in the book, The Hobbit, there's a dragon. He's a bad dragon. He's called Smaug. He's voiced by Benedict Cumberbatch, it turns out, in the films. It's actually worth watching the YouTube of how he practiced it. It's really interesting. Anyway, he collects shiny things, right? That's his raison d'etre. That's what he likes doing. I used to be a software engineer. Nobody lets me write code anymore. It's probably best for everybody. But I used to be a software engineer. And I liked shiny things. Most software engineers like the shinies, right? The new, exciting thing. You wouldn't be here at this conference if you didn't like shiny new things, right? You'd be sitting at home writing COBOL and having no friends. I'm not saying you have friends now, but it would probably be even worse. And apologies if you're all COBOL programs, you've got lots of friends. But you get the general gist, right? We like shiny things. But the problem is that if you collect the shiny things, how are you supposed to know that they're doing the right thing? We had an example at Red Hat a few years ago where a customer came to us and said, we've got this JBoss library. We ship a bunch of JBoss-related products. We've got this JBoss library, which isn't doing exactly what we thought it should do. Could you have a look at it? So we said, yeah, sure. Support, you know. And we looked at it. And the first thing we noticed was that we didn't recognize the library number, the version number. That looks a bit weird. And we did a bit of tracing around, and it was actually a random fork by just some guy off the internet who had forked it before we even took over the JBoss product line. And what had happened was the developer in this customer had just done a search on Google or whatever else they used, and had picked the very first jar file that came up on the list. Yeah, it really, really does happen. So in terms of, but the problem is you can't expect non-security people to get it right all the time. Frankly, you can't expect security people to get it right all the time either. I got fished last week. It's on my blog. I'll tell you about it later on. But we can't expect security people, we can't say it's your responsibility to make sure that you only use the right, the most up-to-date, the most secure libraries, for instance, right? So what we need to do is say, okay, when I press that little green button to move stuff from my environment into compile and test, okay? We need to have some sort of check to ensure that I'm only using stuff I should be using. And you can blacklist if you prefer, but whitelist is easier. And that shouldn't be my responsibility, and by me I mean the non-security expert, to know what that is. What we should have, we need a role, somebody in this process whose job it is to understand that and set up automated processes so that when I press that button, checks are run, and if the wrong thing happens, I, the engineer, get an email back saying, terribly sorry, you shouldn't be using that. Here's the list of things you should use. If you've got a problem, come and talk to X, the person whose responsibility it is. So the responsibility for the security, as far as I'm concerned, is following the process, is actually just using the tools correctly, not about becoming a security expert, because we just can't expect everybody to become security experts. So what you want is a kind of test, probably both between design and build and run, because you never know. Maybe in the time that you've been running the tests, the list has changed, who knows? So that each time you go across one of these sort of liminal barriers, have a liminal barrier? Anyway, every time you go across one of them, checks are automatically done. So this kind of gets to two main things I want to talk about. One is that it's got to be automated. Security has to be baked into the process, or it's just not going to work. We need to be able to manage by exception, say something's gone wrong, we should fix it, rather than just trying to go through every log, trying to teach every engineer to do the right thing all of the time. It just ain't going to work. And it's not just the engineers, it's the dev people, it's the test people, it's the ops people. Everybody, it's the designers. We should use the people, and the second bit is, we should use the people who have the expertise, who have the knowledge, give them the responsibility for setting it up right so that it's easier for everybody else. So what we've got is we've got management points through the process where we can actually do stuff. Think of them as semi-permeable membranes. Stuff can pass if it's the right stuff. It's all automated. It's a chance for us to apply policies, and I'll come back to policies in a minute, exercise some of the government stuff, and log it. Log it, log it, log it, log it, log it. I'll come back to audit, because logging is not the same as audit, but there's some interesting stuff we can think about doing. Right, let's move on to my second example. So, loving your inner auditor. So I'm going to say this quietly, and just to you guys and gals. I used to be an auditor. Yeah. It was a great job. I was working for a credit card company, and they had the view that it wasn't tick box auditing. It was about finding out whether people understood what they were doing. And wasn't PCI DSS. It was different stuff. But it was really interesting. I got to be evil, to think evil, but do good. So it was fun. But the point is that from the groans, most people will have some interaction with an auditor at some point in their lives. And like it or not, the audit process is important. So what I want to do before I address this is just go through what the steps on this circle bit are about. So, and I think it's really important, firstly, to understand that these need to happen in every project, but also that they need to happen in every iteration. It's very easy to forget some of them in iterations. Now, just because you do something doesn't mean you make changes, but you've got to consider it. Okay, so we'll start off with, we're going to identify security requirements and relevant governance models. Now, that could be regulatory models. It could be stuff like HIPAA. It could be models sort of ETSI-NFV type things. It might just be the foundation rules on what you should be doing. But you need to understand what those requirements are and how they fit into what you're going to be doing. And again, I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit. And then we need to think about building. And I said before, you need to make sure that this stuff is built in, automated, part of the process of what you're doing. Then you need to be ensuring that as you deploy, you know what you're deploying onto. Deploying code, deploying executables, libraries, blah, 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 config files, which you kind of trust, onto stuff you don't trust is just irrelevant. You've got to understand what the platform you're running on, what your trust in that is. Trust doesn't need to be complete, but it needs to be contextual, it needs to be timely. So to give an example, most banks wouldn't put their clearing processes onto the public cloud. You would hope, right? But there's a lot more than that. Should you be putting your firewall policies on a general server where a general admin could look at it? Probably not. What about, pay information, legal information, all those sorts of things? Probably not. So you need to think about where you're going. You need to be, we're just north of the border, it's probably safe to say this, not running your own email server if you're running for as a presidential candidate, for instance. Just saying. So you need to know what you're going to be deploying onto. And then you've got to be automating your systems they're actually using to make sure you're compliant with the stuff we talked about before. And this is the important bit, and this is the bit that people miss all the time, that as you're going through the next step, you're revising and updating and remediating not just your functionality. Everyone knows that as you go around a circle, right, you're going to notice changes, you're going to put new functionality in, you're going to realize your users aren't doing quite what they should be doing, or you're deploying in a different place. All of those are true, but what have you learned from the security landscape as well? Are you at a stage in the project now where you can up the security a bit, rather than just leaving it till the end? So these are the bits that I suspect most of us tend to think of as dev and ops, right? DevOps. They're build, run, and maybe manage. I would assert that if you're not actually doing the others as well, you're not really doing DevOps properly. Because you're not really going around a cycle. You're just doing the interesting bits, which are the devs and the ops, right? But if you can't complete the circle, not just for functionality, but for non-functional pieces like security as well, and resilience, and all those other important things, you're not really doing it right, and you are going to have problems. So let's talk a bit about the governance piece. When I go to see customers, if I'm going to see people like sort of C-level or just below C-level, they're not interested in security. Not really. Security is a means to an end. They're interested that they get security because they want to make sure they meet their governance, their regulatory requirements, their liabilities, those sorts of things. But security for security's sake? Nah, not really. Do they care about Bastille? It's a day off if you live in France, right? It's Bastille Day. But apart from that, it's not very interesting to them. So you need to think about what your governance tells you about how you're designing your project, what you're going to be doing in your project. And from that, you can start defining policies. So a policy might be, when I'm deploying a database container, or a container that acts as a database. I'm not suggesting we should all put Oracle in containers. If I'm doing that, these are the container images that I'm allowed to use. If I am doing a UI piece, these are the container images I'm allowed to use. That's a kind of security policy. Maybe you wouldn't even go to that detail. You'd say, well, I must ensure that when I'm using a UI piece, it is unable to access storage directly, or unable to access a database directly. That's more of a policy, right? And from that, you think about the process. So if you remember, I talked about the Smaug problem, for those of you who were here before. That's where you say, OK, when I press that green button, I'm going to put a process in so that we're checking that I'm only taking libraries from my whitelist. It might be running something like SCAP or OpenSCAP. Who knows what SCAP is? Yeah, some really jaded hands going up. It's a US public sector standard, but it's becoming more and more popular across the world, which allows you to specify whether a particular environment, whether that's a container environment or a VM or bare metal, meets a certain set of criteria. So it might be saying something like, it doesn't meet this particular profile if root login is allowed for SSH, for instance. That would be a fairly sensible one. So you might say, I'm going to run a bunch of tests as well. So we're not just saying about whether the right libraries have been used, but whether things have been set up correctly as well. Yeah. We could also say, to go back to my previous one, let's check to see whether the right containers have been used, the container image or the VM image. Check they're using the most up-to-date versions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where your process fits in. And from your process, you can start getting artifacts. Now, an artifact may be as simple as a log entry saying that, for this particular container image or this particular VM, this has been met. And we can say that at this time, 90% of our deployment was using this set of images, and 10% were using this set of images. Or it might be something much more complex than that. So, because the next bit is audit, right? Because this is what the auditors want to look at. But it's not really what the auditors want to look at. Because auditors don't like looking at logs. They'd like something much higher level if you can look at it. It's much easier to tick the boxes. What if, and this is something that a couple of my colleagues from Red Hat, Sean Wells and Keith Basil, Keith Basil's here actually this week, I think, have been doing. There's a set of US public sector requirement documents, which they've gone and they've looked at the requirements that come out of that, and they've written them and they put them into Bugzilla entries. Okay. So as they go through a project, rather than saying, we'll check at the end whether all of my security stuff's right, they say, well, we're going to try and put maybe 2% of in each circle, each sprint maybe, we're going to put 2% of the security requirements in. So you're growing it as you go. So what you want to be able to say is, at this point in the life cycle of our project, it hasn't got a 1.0, it's got to 0.9. But I can show you that of these security requirements, I've met 80% of them. I've got a green bar. I can see that. Or even, once you have got to 1.0, to be able to say, there's this vulnerability, CV that's come up, and I'm worried about it. Can you tell me whether your deployment estate was vulnerable to that particular CV listed vulnerability at 1 a.m. on Monday morning? And if you can go and say, you know what, at 1 a.m., 90% of our containers were running from a container image, had been built for a container image, where that was patched. And by 2:15, an hour and a quarter later, the other 10% had hit it. Your auditor's going to be so pleased, as is your CFO, your CTO, your CEO, all the other people. They're going to love that sort of level of information. But the other thing that they've been doing is saying, as we go through, as these Bugzilla features have a hit, as we do them, they are producing documentation in the form that the auditor wants to see it. They've got scripts that'll run latex or latex, PDF, Word, open document form, whatever it may be. They just push it straight out. That's automation. And that's automating the left-hand side, because now we can go up and say, we can hit the governance stuff too, right? We can now say, what has changed? Do we have new requirements? Did we realize, as we were going through the first couple of cycles, that actually having authentication on this API is not enough? We need to encrypt that API as well. Or we need to move it to an RBAC model from an MBAC model, or vice versa, whatever it may be. That's why you need to go through that, and that's why you need security people involved through the process all the time. So not only is it good, because I gave a figure earlier on that it's cheaper to have a security person doing nothing for 90% of their time than allowing your project to slip in a waterfall model. So not only, hopefully you're saving yourselves money by getting it right, but secondly, you might be making a security person happy as well. Because we're the no people and nobody likes us. And if you can have a security person on your team, and maybe give them a cup of tea from time to time, maybe even invite them out to the pub, you're putting a smile on that security person's face, and they might not weep into their pillow that night. And that's got to be, you don't care, do you? None of you care. You're horrible. Anyway, it is important to do this, and not to expect one person to be able to do it all, right? It is about the expertise and the different bits of what's going on. The person who has the expertise in the adapt thing is going to be different to the person with the expertise in the build team. You know that for the rest of the process. You can't expect a security person to be able to hit all of it as well, although we are superhuman. So I wanted to leave quite a lot of time for some questions. So I've just got a kind of a couple of summary bits. So the first piece that I really want to hammer home is that if you're going to do it, you have to do it all the way through and from the beginning. It's actually harder, arguably, to bolt security on later in a proper DevOps world than it was in the waterfall world. Because if you're not getting into the process to start with, it's going to be very difficult to add it. In my experience, software engineers and tests and ops people are far more resistant to change once they've learned how to do something than just being told that's how we're going to do it from the beginning. And the other thing is, this thing about getting the experts in. Allow responsibilities to live in the right places. Don't expect your software engineers to be security experts in everything, because they're not going to be. And that made me think of something else, and I've completely forgotten a bit about it. So that's just genius. OK, so but the other one, where's the definition of DevSecOps? I gave you that definition before. I'm not particularly happy with it. Making it everybody's responsibility just doesn't really work for me. And this is my answer. It's an enormous cop-out. I'm aware of that. But for me, it's not there's no definition. It's a change in mindset, right? It's not just the tools, not just the technology. It's also the culture of how you do this stuff. And I've written before about how when you're moving to DevSecOps world, it's, in fact, the tools and the technology and the processes they're important, but if you don't get the culture right, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So to finish off with a Bruce Schneier quote from the early days, security is a process, not a product. And I really think that's a good way of looking at it. So I have a blog, lsebob.com. For those of you who are security people, that's funny. For those of you who aren't security people, don't worry. But I try and keep it fairly light. And in fact, yesterday's one was about how I got phished. A bit embarrassing, but I did the right stuff, so it's fine. So I'm going to open up any questions, please. Gentleman at the back. So the question was, is there a link to the Bugzilla list? The answer is there is an open source project called OpenControl, which should allow you to find the stuff you're looking for. Whether it has actually the straight Bugzilla link, I don't know, but it'll set you in the right direction. There's a bunch of stuff going on in that world, but it's a part of the Compliance as Code initiative, which worries me slightly because I worry about the word compliance sometimes. But I think as a principle, the baking it in, automating it, putting it in a process, I'm very much in favor of. So Open Control. It's probably opencontrol.org, but I couldn't swear to it, so do have a look. Any other questions? So there is another one, good, because when I don't get questions, I know I've either given the perfect presentation or the worst presentation. So I don't believe in perfect presentations, as there is no security. So I've now forgotten who it was. That gentleman over there, please, yeah.
So hypothetically, or like as a general advice, for example, if you started your software development process, for example, and now you find yourself in a situation where you actually have to bolt the security process on, what's your suggestion on where to start?
Okay, so the question is, hypothetically, and I love that, because, hypothetically, what if you did start it without thinking about security, and now you need to bolt it on, what's the best way of doing that? Well, firstly, go to some security experts and buy them some beers, if they drink beers, and if they don't, buy them something more expensive. And apologize. Throw yourselves on their mercy. No. Are you a security person or not a security person?
Me?
The gentleman who asked that question.
No, I was just curious.
No, that's fine. So give them an architecture. Show them some pictures. For me, if I can't see pictures, I can't really tell where we are, what the different components are, what the risks are like to be, what the data flows are, what sits where. And if you haven't got an architecture, neither can you. And I don't believe you can really understand your resiliency or your other types of itties either. How are you going to manage those things if you can't really provide an architecture diagram? And there are far, far too many open source projects which don't have architecture diagrams because it all came up in somebody's head, which I understand. I've done that. But as an architect, as a security architect, I need to be able to look at things and say, well, have you considered what happens if you distribute the things at this layer? Are you not introducing possible risks there? I realize that may be the easiest way to provide high availability, for instance, but have you thought about that? Now, from the other way round, if I'm being asked the question as a security guy, how would I go in and say, you know what, you messed up, you should start from the beginning, it's never going to work, right? So the key piece of advice I have if you're trying to get security into something or encourage people to think about security is to talk to them in their own terms. So the classic one is, I talk about this in sort of two directions. One is, if I go to our CTO, CFO, head of sales, whatever, and say, you know what, we're going to have to take down our ordering system for 3 days because it's insecure. He or she will say, good luck with that, and you're fired. If, on the other hand, I'm able to say to him or her, you know what, we've got some problems with our security in our ordering system. And you've got two options, right? You can either take it down for 3 days, will be entirely secure, but you'll be able to take no orders. Or we can run it at, I don't know, 70% capability with a 1% chance that we might lose some payment details, and you won't be able to pay staff salaries that month. They'll take that one, right? I mean, bad luck about the staff salaries, but they'll take that one because they want to keep the business going. What I've done is I've just described the problem in terms of risk, which is how they think. So I've just framed the issue in ways that make sense to them. The same goes if I'm talking to an engineer. If I go to an engineer and say, you have to put authentication on that API or you can't go live, the product manager will say, well, we're going live tomorrow, maybe you can retrofit it. Great. If I say to that engineer, what would happen if somebody put the wrong data into the process at this API? Maybe some malformed data, maybe what would happen if they I don't know, did a denial of service attack on this API? What happens if some with the wrong, oh, that would be terrible. That would really damage the process, the data, my system. And in my experience, people care about the stuff they're working on, right? They want to make sure that the thing works right. And they've got testing, and that's fine. But really being able to say what happens if it actually goes wrong, particularly if it's on purpose, suddenly they're interested. So for me, that's a great way for the other direction to get mind share, I suppose. Talk about what could actually happen. Is it the business impact? Is it the process impact? Is it data impact? Is it, I don't know. You might have to come in on a Sunday if we don't fix this. That's a good one, right? If I can reduce the chances of your coming in on a Sunday by 95%, that's a win. I've just talked to you about stuff you care about. And I think we do far too little of that as security people. We don't talk to people about things they care about. We talk about security stuff and we say no. And I don't think that's very helpful.
Do you have any recommendations on how to secure the dev process itself? So, you're talking about securing the end product a lot, but what about somebody injecting something into a product that's part of the dev team or not into that? Do you have any recommendations?
So the question was, do I have any recommendations on how to secure the dev process itself? I talked a lot about a product, sort of the end product, but what about the process themselves? Well, the easiest, of course, is not to have any developers. If you have no developers, you're pretty safe. There are some flaws with that approach, but it's the one that we as security people prefer. No humans, no problem. It's tricky. So I think it's also particularly tricky in an open source world because we default to trust. We assume good intent most of the time. Now, maybe that's not always right, but it's kind of how the open source world works. And I think, okay, one of the things you can think about is what tools you use. Trying to make sure that you're compiling from known good, the tools as well as the product. Because it's all part of it's all turtles. Do you know this turtle story? I'll tell this turtle story briefly. Sorry, we're nearly done. In the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, a famous philosopher, scientist, some say George Bernard Shaw, was giving a talk to a general audience, just general public audience about science. And he talked about cosmology and evolution and the formation of the Earth and all those sorts of things, and dinosaurs, and huge applause at the end. And at the end, he's standing at the bottom, packing up, and a little old lady comes up to him and says, "That was very interesting, young man." So that's very kind, thanks. He says, "Rubbish, of course." He says, "Sorry, really, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, everybody knows that the Earth is a flat disk, suspended, which rests on elephants, on a turtle," clearly a Discworld fan. And he said, "Madam, but that's all very well, but if that's true, what does the turtle stand on?" He said, "Its turtle's all the way down." So it's a dictum in the security world that you've got to have a bottom turtle. There's got to be something you trust. And you need to choose that carefully. And your dev tools have got, in some way, to be that thing. Maybe you say it's the hardware that the dev tools are compiled on. Maybe it's the firmware. I don't know. It's difficult. Part of it has got to be based on whether things work behaviorally. You're going to have to do some checking of that. Code review, making sure that things are behaving as they expected, that people are behaving as they expected. They're not doing things they shouldn't be. There is no perfect. And there's certainly no perfect being able to look at a piece of code and saying, that's never going to be a problem because of the Church-Turing hypothesis. I hate to bring it back all the way to that, but that's the way it works. So I've got time for a very brief one. That gentleman you had?
The only way I've seen it truly successfully work is when the security team meets the devs in the dev land by making developer tools that integrate with their lifecycle.
So thank you. We're very happy to finish on that. The only way to make it work is getting the security folks to talk to the devs in the dev land and make it all work. I'm happy to end with that. Thank you very much indeed for your time and enjoy the blog. Thank you.